Hey, everybody, and welcome to our July 25th edition of Shank's Children's Lit Show. And before I go any farther, we are blessed with the presence of a kitty. He's right. Oh, there you are. There you are. This is, I think, as close as he's gotten all semester. He's right here, right against the keyboard. I don't know how I'm going to get any work done or how I'm going to manage all the stuff I want to cover today. It's not that much stuff actually, but anyway, he's going to make it a little bit difficult. So if I fumble on the keyboard or I start yelling at him because he's in my way, you'll know why. Well, there he is again. Here you go. Hey, kitty. Cookie. You might as well get some screen time. Not facing the camera, but oh, here we go. Why don't we just show Charlie for an hour? I'll give you all a break. Probably be more entertaining. Probably more educational too. I don't know. Oh well, I gotta earn my money. I gotta do something today. We can't just look at Charlie all day. All right, today I want to do a few things. I want to share your answers to the fantasy homework that you turned in earlier to kind of wrap up our discussion of fantasy. We've talked about uh, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. We talked about Charlotte's Web. And to wrap it up, we'll talk about some of your examples that you added. And of course, there's such a wonderful wide variety of works of fantasy for children, both classics and recent. And I liked the examples I got from you guys because it was a nice mix of classic and more recent titles of fantasy. Then we're going to preview and talk about uh, realistic fiction as our next genre. And of course, I had you read Bridge to Terabithia for today. And we're going to go over most of the quiz questions for Terabithia today, but I'm going to save, well, maybe what I consider the most important question about how it deals with the serious issue of death and how it shows, I believe, very realistically, the different stages of grief that Jess goes through. It's one of the reasons why I chose the book, because I think it does a very good job of that. But I'm recording this on Wednesday. Only a couple people have turned in their answers to this question or those questions. So I think I'll save our discussion of those last couple questions for next Monday's lecture when I have everybody's answers in and we can kind of share all of those because that's really the thing I want to focus on in regards to Bridge to Terabithia. Also, we'll talk a little bit about criteria for judging realistic fiction, in particular, the issues that children, especially as they get older, will start to face. And so many of these works hopefully deal realistically with the kinds of issues that children have to deal with as they get older. And again, death being one of them. When you're a small child, very small child, and say a grandparent passes or maybe a pet passes, you might not have a clear understanding of exactly what all that means. But as you get older, I think the impact is much stronger. And I think you begin to understand that issue, and I think it affects you a little bit more. And I think that's true of a lot of these issues. So I want to kind of preview that. And then this leads to the assignment that I'm going to ask you to do for Sunday by midnight. including the reading of our next book, which is Wonder. And we're going to break that reading up into sections. So let me preview that first. So let's go to the homework. And I don't know, do we have any Stranger Things fans? If you are, you'll know what the connection is between the picture and Class 11. That's the character 11, who I think is the anchor of that show. I think she's wonderful. And I'm not saying Stranger Things is necessarily work for kids, but that's what I thought of when I wanted to prepare the Class 11 assignment. All right, so here are the assignments. First of all, obviously watch this lecture. Take note of the numbers in sequence. And let's start with the number 1 today. 1 will be our first number. And then I have also now included in the Canvas the 4 student presentations in the fantasy science fiction genre. So please read those because you are responsible for those for the final exam. There will be a question on the final exam about the student presentations. So please read up on those. Also, as we continue to talk about realistic fiction, please read in the Canvas packet 171 to 186. Then, as I said, I'm going to ask you to read Wonder, at least about half of it for Monday's lecture, and then the other half for Thursday's lecture. You want to go ahead and get a head start and get get ahead of things over the weekend. If you want to go ahead and read all of it for the weekend, I encourage you to do that. But and I think once you get into it, I think I've mentioned this before. This is my favorite book of all the ones that I have students read in children's literature. And I think once you get into it, you might want to go ahead and just read all of it. But it is a little bit longer than the other ones I've had you read. So I wanted to kind of give you a break on the reading and not expect you to read all of it before Sunday by midnight. But do read at least the first 4 parts so we can kind of get started talking about it. In most editions, that's to page 185, but the parts are clearly delineated. One of the interesting things about the book is that each chapter is narrated by a different character. Our main character gets most of the chapters, but on occasion, other characters, like his friend, like his sister, etc., they also have a chapter where they give their point of view. So it's kind of an interesting kind of narration. So read parts 1 to 4. And then here is the assignment that I'm going to ask you to do. It's in the Canvas called Realistic Precepts Assignment. When you read the book, one of the running themes through the story is this idea of precepts. They have a teacher who gives the students a series of precepts, sayings, words of wisdom, I should say, throughout the story. And I thought this would be kind of a cool way to begin our discussion of Wonder and the first half of Wonder. So this is the assignment. So let's go to that. All right, how about another number? How about number 4 as our second number? All right. So here is the assignment. And, again, I think when we start talking about the serious issues that children begin to face in the real world, we're moving from fantasy now to realistic fiction because, of course, at some point, kids have to sadly face the real world and the realities of the real world. And I think it really starts to hit them in their tween years, which would be the years between 10 years and 12 years old. And you're going to read a little bit about tweens in the Canvas. So here are the assignments. So after you have read, or while you're reading the first four parts of Wonder, and you get the idea of the concept of precepts, this is kind of a, I don't know, fun assignment, but I think it's also relevant to what we're talking about when we're getting into realistic fiction. It says here, based on your experiences of as survivors of childhood and adolescence, so you are survivors, what are any five or more, if you want to give me a couple more for extra credit? The assignment will be worth 20 points total, but if you want to kick in a couple more than five and get a few more points, you can do that. Uh, but what are any five or more pieces of advice, words of wisdom that you would give to children today? And again, particularly those tweens that are on the cusp of adolescence. That's the age of the kids in the book Wonder. They're in that tween stage. And we've all gone through, well, you've gone through it much more recently than I have. Uh, but you know what those years are like. You know, you're not really a little kid anymore, but you're not a teenager yet. But you are becoming more and more aware of the world around you and the realities of the world around you. Um, so what are at least five pieces of advice, words of wisdom that you would give to children today uh, based on what you've gone through, what you've experienced? So you are kind of the wise mentor here. Here's your chance to play mentor. I don't know how many of you maybe have younger siblings or maybe younger nieces and nephews in your family or whatever the case may be, but you see them at that particular age and you say to yourself, boy, you know, I'd like to be able to tell them some things that might help them navigate the tween years leading up to, of course, the scary adolescent years. Didn't have to be scary, but you know what I mean. All right, so give me five precepts. And again, Mr. Brown in the book is the king of precepts, so you might look over a couple of his and then see if you can come up with a few that are similar based on your experiences. And also then, after you've come up with the precepts, can you think of any works? And by works, again, we mean maybe books, movies, TV shows, cartoons, whatever, that you could recommend to kids that might help show that particular precept or precepts. All right. And for prompts, these are, I guess, what we would consider to be um, current issues that children becoming tweens into adolescence start to deal with, have to start to understand and experience in their lives. And if I were to ask you on the exam, for example, you know, what are some general themes and current issues that kids have to deal with? This is what I'm getting at. And the reason I bring these up too is because I said the other day, you know, when we're judging realistic fiction, I don't have a real set list of criteria for you. Um, it basically is, you know, is this work realistic, you know, in its depiction of a particular issue? This also ties in with historical fiction, which will be our next and last genre. You know, one of the things we judge historical fiction is how realistic is it based on what we know about the history of the time. So some of these stories will be based in a different time period than ours, but I'm focusing now on, you know, more recent times and more recent works. So that's basically what we're going to judge these works on is do they, I guess we'll ask two different questions. The first question would be, what are some of the issues that are depicted in this particular work, whether it's Terabithia, whether it's Wonder, whether it's some other example that you're going to come up with eventually, and how well and how believable and how realistic, based on your experiences, does it deal with this given issue or theme? So that's basically a two-part criteria. You know, what are the issues depicted here, and how realistically or not do they deal with these issues? And, you know, obviously, if you can make the case that they are very realistic in their depiction of different issues, then we give them a thumbs up. If you look at the work, whether it's a TV show or whatever, and say, you know what, kids would be misled by this, or they sugarcoat this too much, or it really isn't realistic the way they depict some of these issues and themes, then you would say that I'd give that a thumbs down. I would find some other work that deals with this issue in a more realistic way. So that's the kind of critique and the kind of criticisms that we would make in regards to this genre. All right, so what are some of the general themes and current issues? I actually have this in a separate Canvas file as well, but I went ahead and included it in this assignment for you. I'm having trouble with this mouse. I think I need a new mouse, but anyway. Coming of age, like I said, transitioning into the tween years and into the teenage years. How are the relationships with the peers in the story realistically portrayed? I think I don't want to give too much away, but I think Wonder has a really interesting relationship between our main character and his sister, for example. And like I said, in Wonder, his sister actually gets a chance to give her point of view and her side of the story in her narration. So, you know, brothers and sisters, are these issues, are these themes dealt with realistically? And just general family relationships in general. How about peer relationships? You know, relationships with friends. Are those dealt with realistically? You know, once you get older, you know, peers become more and more important to you, I think, leading up to maybe the teen years where probably, well, you know, I was going to say, you know, peer relationships are very important when you're a teen. You know, peers are always going to be important to you. You know, the opinion of peers and your standing with your peers is always going to be important, no matter what age you are. But it seems to me, particularly in the tween years into the teenage years, that's perhaps when it's most important that you fit in and that you have friends and that other kids like you. And then does the work effectively and realistically deal with that whole issue? And does it deal with what it feels like not to fit in realistically, which is probably the theme of a lot of stories for kids. And a lot of kids go through that. We start to look at things like alcohol and drugs, starting to enter into the child's world. Is that effectively portrayed if it's in the story? We start to look at things like special needs, children with special needs. If there is a character or characters in the story that have those special needs, is that situation realistically dealt with or not? And again, this would be particularly important, obviously, for a child with special needs to read a story where they can see themselves in the story and they can identify with the character or characters. And they can say, yes, this is my story and it's realistically told. I think in a way, our character in Wonder is in a sense a special needs child. And again, I don't want to give too much away. They begin to enter a world where violence and abuse of different kinds can become a factor. And again, are these issues realistically portrayed? At some point, you know, one of the great things about getting older as a child is you begin to become accustomed and exposed to different races and different classes, and you have to navigate your way through that and be aware that there is such a thing. You know, when children are thrown together from different races and backgrounds, I don't think it matters too much to them. As long as, you know, it's like, oh, I got somebody to play with. That's cool. But as you get older, unfortunately, maybe the adult world expects them to feel differently or act differently towards somebody of a different race or a different class or a different economic standing, and things start to separate us instead of uniting us. And that's perhaps when it starts to happen. in the tween years into the teenage years. So does the work deal with this issue effectively if that issue is in the story? Um, Other things such as cultural differences, diversity, sexual orientation, and gender identity. Of course, that's been a very strong and pervasive theme in a lot of works recently. And of course, I don't have to, I think this goes without saying, but I guess I'll say it, bring it up right now. Of course, a lot of works that are aimed at young readers that deal with a lot of these issues, of course, finally end up on banned and challenged book lists because of the fact that they deal with these sensitive and mature issues and themes. And so we're going to see a lot of that. And again, we talk much more about this in my Lit for Young Adults class, but we see this in works for children as well, particularly works for tweens, as I said. Let me give you another number. How about the third number will be 6? Third number is 6. Or anything that seems to set children apart, which we would call exceptionalities. Certainly, the child in Wonder is very exceptional, very, very different than his peers. And we'll see examples that he has to deal with for that. Charlie just left the building. So anyway, another issue that might be very prevalent in some of our lives as kids is bullying. Um, uh, we see this growing up, and this is the kind of thing we have to deal with. And does the work deal with this issue? And if it does it do so realistically? We saw a little bit of this. We didn't really talk about it too much, but we saw a little bit of this in Bridge to Terabithia. There is a bully character in that story, and it's interesting how that issue kind of resolves itself. And, very sensitively, I think, it does point out that, perhaps the reason the child is a bully is because maybe they're having difficulties in their own lives at home, and this is their way of acting out or whatever. All right, so we have a bully character in that story. We're going to have a bully character in Wonder, so be on the lookout for that. And then other issues like how important it is to look the way other kids look. Appearance becomes very important. And then we get into, suicide issues. I don't think children, generally speaking, consider, the idea of suicide. But again, once these issues perhaps get to be too much and they feel overwhelmed and, they become depressed and etc., this might be the first time a child, starts thinking about this as a option. And does the work deal with this very, very serious issue realistically and effectively? And again, it's very important that you would cover and show an issue like this in a very sensitive and realistic way. In my Lit for Young Adults class, we do 13 Reasons Why, which is not a book I would have kids read under 12. Age appropriateness, again, and a lot of these, again, it comes back to what we've always been talking about. Age appropriateness is very important when considering which of these books we should have kids read and at what age. So always be aware of that. But this is an issue that comes up. Once kids reach the tween years, puberty starts to become a factor. Does the work deal effectively with this if the characters in the story are dealing with this? There's the classic, "Are you there, God? It's me, Margaret." Kind of opened the door for a lot of books about puberty-related issues. More modern issues like the internet, which now kids deal with. I mean, a lot of children now have their own phones. They have access to online sources and internet sources. And I think a lot of books recently have dealt with this issue. Does it do it realistically if there is issues like that. Clicks, which is a common thing, obviously, we see. Some issues might also involve things that you could relate to. Perhaps some of you have had to move when you were children. This is going to be very, very difficult. What do you do when you're in sixth grade and your parents come home one day and say, we're moving to another state, and you have friends and you have relationships and you're comfortable and you're settled, and suddenly you're moved into a totally different situation and have to make friends all over again, and you're the outsider. A lot of books deal with this issue because a lot of kids have to go through this situation, sometimes more than once. And does the work effectively and realistically show the changes that a kid has to go through when moving from one place to the other? Siblings, relationship with siblings, again, we could talk about that. Another issue that, again, children, when they're young and their parents divorce, they may not comprehend exactly what's going on or the reasons why. But as they get older, I think they would be more understanding and more sensitive and more acute to what's actually happening between their parents. Maybe some of you are children of divorce. I was. So again, if the work deals with this issue and how it affects a child or a tween into the teenage years, does it handle that issue effectively? And there may be a death of a loved one. I almost left out the last one, which of course we're going to talk about in regards to Bridge to Terabithia. I think that book deals with this issue that all kids are going to have to go through. Of course, we have to go through this in our lives. I always say that if you have the experience of living as long as I have, you'll experience any number of losses in your life, and it probably starts when you are a child. I was pretty lucky. My two grandfathers passed even before I was really old enough to know them. But my two grandmothers lived to be quite old. So there was a long period in my childhood when really no family member had passed away. But I know for a lot of you, you began to experience loss early on, and you had to deal with it and understand it. And there are a lot of works for kids that deal with this subject. And again, we have to judge them and say, are they realistically portraying this very important, passage that we all go through, and the realization that, the people who are close to us in our lives will not always be there, sadly. And there are probably others too that I have not included here, but these are what I mean by the general themes and current issues that we will look at when we judge realistic fiction. And also, as I'm going through these, maybe you've experienced some of these kind of situations, and that might help prompt you to come up with your 5 precepts. So do you have any advice? Do you have any words of wisdom to a child who may have to experience some of these issues, and maybe you've experienced them? And I think it's kind of a nice way and a personal way to share our wisdom in this assignment. And it's a good way to talk about realistic fiction. So that's the assignment that's due on by Sunday by midnight, and we'll discuss a lot of these then during Monday's lecture. And again, start reading Wonder as well and the associated pages in the Canvas. All right, let me give you a third number. How about number 6? Number 6. To wrap up fantasy, I thought I would just share briefly with you your answers to the homework assignment in which you shared with us one example of fantasy and went over the different classifying questions, which I think is a really good way to study fantasy in children's literature, which is why I gave you the assignment. Go figure. So let's take a look at that. And I will have these posted in Canvas so you can kind of FYI. But again, I think this is a very good way to study for the final exam. Any questions I might ask you about criteria for fantasy or science fiction. Kind of take a quick look at what other students have done in addition to what you did for this assignment. And again, I'm not going to ask you anything specifically about, what people did in this particular assignment. But again, I think it's a really good way to solidify the things that I think are important when discussing fantasy. Shreya did, again, I love the mixture of uh, classic works and then much more recent works. Of course, A Christmas Carol is a classic. And so I won't read all of the things that everybody wrote. I was particularly interested in 7 and 8. And again, notice this because I focused on this, uh, what are ways that the creator of the work uh, tried to make the fantasy world realistic and believable. And each one of these examples that you guys gave did that. So for example, in A Christmas Carol, Dickens grounds the story in the customs and social issues of the time. He certainly does that. The setting is rendered in a high level of detail, and the characterization is conducive to the setting. All right. So he grounds it, and again, this is a work that takes place, a couple centuries ago. But it's very believably and realistic told. That setting is very realistic to the time before the fantasy aspects begin to materialize and all the ghosts arrive to uh, uh, beleaguer Mr. Scrooge until he sees the error of his ways. And again, I was very interested in number 8. How does the work also meet criteria of good children's literature? And this is a story about empathy, among many other things. Emma did Howl's Moving Castle, the movie version. And again, she does a good job of answering the opening questions. Including, and again, I would encourage you, I won't read all of these, but I would encourage you to take a look at, some of the answers to whether or not this work would be controversial in any way, might be on banned and challenged book lists. I know some of them are. And again, it could be a possible, looking ahead to the final paper topic, by the way, might be something you might take on. Howl's Moving Castle has strong anti-war themes, as she points out. Very true. Another classic, Corinne, Shared Beauty and the Beast. And again, we had a nice mix of high and light fantasy examples. Also, I would pay particular attention. Each work probably has a theme, some message, lesson, moral that the story portrays to kids. And again, how is it believable? I would say the author creates a detailed, believable, and consistent world by using mostly real and genuine situational factors throughout the story. And then adding in the bits and pieces that make it fantasy, like the talking wardrobe, teapot, teacup, etc. Right? So, ground the story in reality first. Seems to be a common theme. And then we see magic used, romance, and lasting love, and an easy to capture antagonist-protagonist role. Haley did Frozen, and if you have any kids in your family in the last, I don't know, 10 years or so, you're probably very familiar with Frozen. My niece loved Frozen, or I guess I should say my grandniece loves Frozen, so I'm very familiar with that story. I think probably a lot of you are too, but she does a really good job of giving a plot summary. As far as believability, I believe that this story is believable because it is based off Norway. The setting is realistic. It starts off with, the two sibling relationships realistically portrayed. There's kind of a sibling rivalry, but they're also very close, obviously. Um, and then qualities, characteristics, illustrations, the animation is beautifully done. Uh, Kaylin, well, Kaylin failed. I'm sorry. It was so sad. I hate to fail students, but she did the story about the rat, and I just couldn't read it. So I'm sorry. No, I'm joking, of course. She did Ratatouille, and again, I'm sorry, the whole concept just makes me squeamish. So you can read what she said. I'm not even going to talk about it. But anyway, how is it believable? Um, Linguini is pretty quick to realize that Remy understands him. The relationships are realistic, even though they're among, rats and stuff. Ugh. Um, and a nice listing of the qualities and criteria of children's literature. Obviously, an escape into fantasy world, that's what all of these are going to have in common. But you get a chance to gain new vocabulary, stimulate and expand your imagination, which is, again, another common thing that I think we'd probably see in all of these fantasy works. Uh, get a chance to develop an interest and hobby. I imagine a number of kids watching this might begin to have an interest in cooking and whatever. Um, Stretch attention spans. Movies last a little bit longer, and so you got to sit and watch it, and grow the bond between the child and the adult. A child wants to learn how to cook, so who do they go to? Well, they'll go to the adults in their lives. So, good job, Kaylin, even though you picked a story about a rat in the kitchen, which just kind of turns my stomach. Okay. I haven't given you my Shrek rant either, by the way, have I? Well, I'm going to save that. Maybe save that for later. Gabby, oh my God. Now see, Gabby reached my heart here. I love The Princess Bride. Everybody should watch The Princess Bride. Um, High fantasy. What I love about The Princess Bride is it not only meets a lot of the criteria of fantasy, but it also kind of satirizes those same elements. So it's a very funny movie. And if kids are old enough to know uh, the tropes and the archetypes of fantasy, uh, then they'll get the humor when they're being satirized in the story. Uh, and again, there's so many tropes and fairy tales that we see in this story, but they're kind of twisted and they're kind of put on their ear a little bit. And kids, when they get old enough, uh, I think there's a period in a lot of kids' lives when satire is like their favorite thing because they're smart enough and they're aware enough to know that when something is being satirized, or something is a takeoff of something else. For me, I'm going to date myself now, but there was a certain period in my life when I loved Mad Magazine. And I don't even know if you guys know what Mad Magazine was. It went out of business with a lot of magazines in recent years, but it's a very satirical magazine geared for tweens and up. And I loved that because it made fun of all the stuff I saw in the world around me. And it was for me, and I got it. I got the jokes because I knew what the satire was all about. Tyara did Monsters Inc. Oh, another great example. Um, the monsters live normal lives, even though they're monsters. So it's grounded in some kind of reality. Irali did Jimmy Neutron, another great example. Um, Jimmy Neutron is a believable show because it follows its own wacky rules. So, as we tried to point out last week, one of the things we judge fantasy on is we know it's a fantasy, but within the realm of fantasy that it's created, are the rules consistent within it? And if they are, then that helps make the entire fantasy more realistic and believable. Uh, so Irale points out that Jimmy Neutron has that. Um, Other criteria, it teaches kids to be creative problem solvers. It also reminds them it's okay to be different and encourages everyone to see things as exciting adventures full of wonder. Uh, Most importantly, Jimmy always invents new things that make the viewers laugh. Great show. And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Jimmy Neutron, grew up with Jimmy Neutron. Pan's Labyrinth, Jenna did this. This is a great example of high fantasy. So again, I love the mixture of high and light fantasy. A lot of good notes on how uh, believability is established even within the fantasy realm. So take a look at those. Lauren did How to Train Your Dragon. Again, another one I'm sure you're all familiar with. What I love about these assignments is as we're going through them, I'm sure a lot of you are going, oh yeah, I love that show. Or I love that movie, or I love that. And she does a wonderful job of covering all the different points. Um, and then a lot of good notes on how believability is established in the story. Um, the story starts in medias res, which was one of your literature terms, literally in the midst of things. The details, I'm sorry, the dragons are described in detail, and so are the smelly Vikings. Okay. So again, if the details are so vividly described, even though you know they couldn't exist in the real world, you buy into it. You buy into the premise. And it makes it realistic for you and believable. Grace did Jumanji, another classic picture book that was later made into a movie, and the movie, of course, expanded it beyond everything. Um, one technique Van Allsburg uses is grounding the story in a realistic setting. Most of the story takes place inside Judy and Peter's home. There's also a clear boundary between the fantastical, represented by the board game, and the real. He also uses characters who question the fantastical elements of the story, namely Judy and Peter's parents. So there's a doubt, there are doubters in the story, very common theme. Um, but they eventually come around. And qualities and characteristics, Jumanji stimulates and expands readers' imaginations and invites them on an exciting adventure. His illustrations uses a blend of real and surreal elements. And again, it's interesting if some of you did picture books that represented fantasy, it's interesting to note what kind of style of art they choose to use. And she's exactly right here. It's a mixture of real, like images, but then also surrealistic when we're getting into the fantasy element. So you can visually see the difference between the real and the fantasy. All right, so I enjoy these immensely. A great list of varied kinds of fantasy. Some of them are classics, some of them are new, some of them are movies, some of them are books, some of them are high, some of them are light. So I thought this was a really good representation of the kind of thing we're talking about. So you might want to look over each one of these in a little bit more detail. I kind of sketched over them, but well done on that front. All right, how about another number? How about number 8? Number 8 will be our fourth number. All right, the last thing I wanted to do today is let's talk a little bit about our first example of what I would call realistic fiction. And these are the questions that I posed to you on the quiz. And I'm also going to answer a few of the other ones that I didn't have you answer, but I thought would be noteworthy. First of all, the setting of the story, it was written in 77. It was published in 77, and it was meant to be a modern day story. So that's the setting as far as the time period goes. Lark Creek, Virginia. And I think the setting is interesting because it's obviously a rural setting in Virginia, but it's also close enough to DC, Washington, DC, so that, Leslie's parents, particularly her father, has work to do there. So it goes back and forth between the rural setting and obviously our nation's capital. Um, And the time period, again, some things have changed since then. Maybe some things are more slow to change in the last 40 some years. But the setting, the time period does influence the story. We'd like to think that maybe things would be a little bit different today. Maybe the boy-girl roles wouldn't be so strictly enforced, although again, you could probably point to examples where it still is. But again, this is a rural farm community. Most of the people there are farmers and not particularly wealthy. Most of them are like uh, his parents. Most of them are like Jess's parents. Leslie and her family is the outlier. They're much different. Um, so Leslie's parents are wealthy, educated from the city, whereas everybody else in town are from that town. So there is a class tension there, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So, could the story take place in 2024 and kind of play out the same way? In some ways, yes, maybe in some ways, no. Hopefully, we've kind of moved forward a little bit from then. Um, Jess tried to break the bounds of what was expected of him. He's a farm boy and he's expected to do his chores and whatever. But he did have that little creative side that he hid from most people because, again, you know, drawing art, that's just not something boys do. Um, but he did like to draw, and uh, he was encouraged by, obviously, Jess encouraged him, and also Miss Edmonds encouraged him. And by the way, they're referred to in a couple of instances in the story as hippies. And again, that would be a term that would be used in the late 70s for anybody who kind of went against the accepted norms of conservative society. I don't want to get too much into politics here, but we all obviously have a sort of conservative liberal sort of uh, conflict in the story too. Um, don't go there, Mr. Shank. Okay, I won't go there. But you know what I'm saying. I have a feeling that most of the people in the town were conservatives, and I have a feeling, Leslie and her family were more liberal minded, if you want to put it that way. Um, so he loved to draw animals, and he had an imagination, fantastical situations. And Miss Edmonds and Leslie encouraged him, but his parents, particularly the father, said, I don't know if I like this kid drawing. I don't know if I like him hanging around too much with this girl. And again, it's the old, gender stereotype, the gender roles. We don't want him to become, I don't think the word is ever used, but we don't want him to become a sissy. That's not something a man does. It's not something a boy does. So he fights that stereotype. And that's one of the things that she brings out in him, his creative nature. She makes it okay for him to like to draw, and she encourages him to do that, as well as the hippie teacher, Miss Edmonds. The very first time he lays eyes on Leslie, kind of symbolic and sort of foreshadowing. From a distance, he thought she was a boy because of the way she dressed and the way her hair was. And of course, she's very good at running. So again, she breaks a lot of the gender stereotypes of the time. And I guess they're stereotypes that still need to be broken today, um, which is why I think, even though there are some dated aspects of the story, sadly, I think some of these issues are still timeless. I think there's still a lot of kids dealing with this, gender identity, gender roles, you know, um, girls think, why do I have to wear pink? Or why do I have to play with dolls? And boys say, uh, I'm not interested in guns, or I'm not interested in sports or whatever. And I got to deal with backlash because I'm not doing the things that are traditionally expected of me. So I think that's one of the things this book is about, which I think makes it relevant today. And she is very different than the other kids, as we pointed out. You get the impression that the two parents are both working, which again in the late 70s, that was still kind of unusual. I think nowadays it's almost a given that unless you're very wealthy, both parents are going to work. It's just kind of a necessity. So that was kind of unusual still back in the late 70s. Um, both successful, both were writers, so they both were literary. I think there's one mention that was kind of interesting that uh, the father wrote uh, about politics and the mother wrote novels. And it sounds to me from one of the mentions that the mother was actually more financially successful because, novels, will probably always sell better than books about politics. I think that's probably still true today. Um, Doesn't dress up, even though they're the richest, they become the richest family in town, right? One of the ironies is they're the richest family in town, and yet she doesn't dress up. Wears overalls, looks like a boy from a distance, like we said. Um, oh my God, eats yogurt for lunch. Now that's one thing that's changed over the years. That's pretty accepted now. So I guess there is progress to be made. And of course, she doesn't even have a TV. Oh my God. Uh, and again, in the 70s, before the internet and whatever, TV was like the main source of entertainment. And by the way, we're getting into my era now. I can remember back in these days. So anyway, and actually, her not having a TV leads to one of the more important moments in the story, which we're going to get to. Why are they here? Well, again, this is again, I don't want to get into politics or whatever, but this is kind of a liberal sort of idea. Her parents were worried that, they were exposing her to some of the wrong ideas about value structure, and they wanted to change the lifestyle and get back to nature, et cetera, et cetera. So this was all their idea. And um, so that's why they're here. And of course, she sticks out like a sore thumb for all the reasons we've talked about. And she has a very difficult transition. I mean, most kids either make fun of her or won't have anything to do with her. The other girls apparently don't really have much to do with her. And so her one friend is Jess, and she becomes really uh, his best friend or only friend as well. All right. Well, number 8, I didn't ask you to answer this question, but I think it is a significant story and plot line in the story. Um, if you remember, uh, the teacher was very impressed by her article on sea life and scuba diving and so on, and shared it with the class. And by the way, maybe this is probably universal. You know, I think I was always embarrassed, or I think most kids were always kind of embarrassed when a teacher would single you out and say, "Oh, look, let's read the wonderful essay that Matthew wrote." And you're kind of shrinking in your chair because it's like, oh, they're going to make fun of me. I'm the teacher's pet, and God, don't read my essay. So that's bad enough. But then when she assigns uh, a project for the kids, asking them to read, or I'm sorry, to watch the special from Jacques Cousteau, who is a famous oceanographer, by the way. Google him, kids. This is somebody I remember. I remember his specials vividly. Um, and they make the teacher makes an assignment of it, so you're doubly embarrassed because, oh my God, now they have to do something because I wrote something. And then the topper was, you know, when they're told to watch this special on TV, Leslie has to admit that their parents, they don't have a TV because that's part of their, change in value systems. We're not going to be dependent on the TV, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, this just blows the kid's mind. So even the poorest kid in this small Virginia town, farm town, at least they all have a TV, for my God's sake. Um, so this is just one more thing that kind of sets her apart, and really kind of is a snapping point. That's the one point when she sort of breaks down and cries. She hates it here. She feels different. Usually, and over the years when I've taught this book, I usually ask the question, and sometimes I'm surprised at the answer. Um, and you can just answer it on your own listening to me. Um, Sometimes I ask kids, when you were growing up, did you know any kids that didn't have a TV? And when I used to ask the question, there used to be a couple people or a few students who would say yes. And then I would kind of ask them a little bit, were they ostracized for it? I mean, because that's a common thing in kids' lives. You watch something on TV. And I guess this was probably more common in my time during these years, 60s and the 70s, than it is today. But something big was on TV, and every kid had to watch it. And then the next day, that's what everybody talked about. Hey, did you see the latest episode of whatever? And yeah, we all saw it, and that's something you talk about in recess or whatever. And it just seemed to me the kids who didn't have a TV, that would be one more way to ostracize them. Oh, you don't have a TV, then you're not hip to what we're watching. So she was kind of humiliated by that as well. Interestingly enough, there are a number of different references to the Narnia series. Leslie is a fan, and she mentions that. There is a island in the story, not in the episode that we read, but in later episodes called Terabithia. So she uses that as her inspiration for Terabithia, and it just kind of reinforces the importance of being creative and having a little fantasy in your life, having a little imagination in your life. And again, that's what she uses to deal with some of her issues, and she passes that along to Jess. It's okay to use your imagination. I know this is just a forest with some trees and whatever, but we can make it our own special little fantasy land with just a little bit of work and a lot of imagination. And that's what they do, obviously. What was his Christmas gift to her? Uh, what was hers to him? Well, she gives him, again, because they have some money, a very expensive paint set, because again, she wants to encourage him to continue to draw. And she doesn't have much money, but he doesn't have much money, but he's able to find a little puppy uh, to give to her. And they name it Prince Tyrion, which is very Terabithia-like. And we'll talk more about uh, the stages of grief and et cetera, et cetera. But to kind of preview that, after she passes away, Jess, in kind of a fit of anger and depression and grief and guilt and whatever, tosses the paint set into the creek. And of course, probably immediately regrets doing that, but it was a reaction. I'm gonna save a comment about that till later. And the puppy eventually goes with the parents as they leave town. Very important little subplot to the story. And I think a lot of kids might miss this, but we being older and more mature might get it. Oh, and by the way, let's give another number. How about 12? 12. At some point, his family invites her to church. And again, they're strict believers of religion and Christianity, et cetera, and they go to church faithfully and religiously every Sunday. And you get the sense that they kind of hate it, but it's like what they have to do, you know. Meanwhile, the more open-minded, and again, I don't want to use the word liberal too loosely, but Leslie comes from a family that doesn't really believe, which is, again, this might be one of the reasons why the book is on banned and challenged book list. But what I think is particularly poignant about this and interesting is, like I said, well, she even makes a comment about it. She says, uh, you have to believe this and hate it. I don't have to believe it, and I love it. I find the Jesus story very interesting, and I find all the stuff that was said in this in the church service to be very interesting, and I enjoyed the experience. Meanwhile, you guys were miserable, and it was kind of interesting. Um, like I said, she doesn't have to believe, and she enjoys it. They have to believe, and they don't. Um, and the other thing I think a lot of kids will miss, and I don't know if you guys caught it or not as well, but the question I asked you was, explain his mother's attitude toward Leslie. And I think the best way to describe it would be the mother feels threatened by this little girl. And again, I don't think kids would necessarily catch that, because you figure, well, why would an adult be afraid or feel threatened by a child? But here's where the class differences come in. Here's where the economic differences come in. I get the sense that the mother, even though they're from a poor rural farm family in the small town in Virginia, this is a woman who has a certain amount of pride, and she sees her son hanging out with this rich girl, rich city girl, um, and uh, from a higher class, and is so afraid that the girl may say or do something that would make her and her family embarrassed or humiliated, because they don't have what this little girl has and her family has. So again, a child may not be aware of class distinctions, but I hope you caught that. I'm in the process of reading your answers to these questions. Um, but again, I think, an adult being intimidated would be another word. I think the mother, the grown woman, is intimidated by this girl who's obviously educated, comes from a wealthy family, comes from the city, sophisticated, has seen and done things that she has never done, let alone her son. And she's just afraid that, the girl, the worst thing that could happen would be the girl would somehow like turn her nose up at the family and say, oh, you're poor or you're whatever. And she would dread that because, at least she has her pride. And to Leslie's credit, of course, she's a wonderful girl and she would never do that. But there's the fear, there's the threat of somebody from a higher class looking down on somebody from a lower class, even though it's a child looking down on, that's what the adult was afraid of. And of course, that didn't happen. And so they take her to church and she loved the experience. Meanwhile, they kind of do it out of a duty or an obligation, which it's one of my favorite parts of the book. Um, what is the evil spell? This is a little bit of foreshadowing. Leslie calls it an evil spell that an evil spirit has cast when there's a lot of rain. And of course, the fact that on one particularly rainy day, we have a very fateful thing happen, which we'll talk about in our next meeting. I'm going to save all that discussion for death for later. Why does he hit Maybelle and how does he make it up to her? Well, she made the childlike mistake of asking him very blunt, sensitive questions. And she asked him, well, did you see her laid out? And, you know, that's what snaps. I think that is his last straw. And he's kept it in, he's kept his emotion in, his anger. Um, but then when his little sister says something so insensitive, he loses it and he strikes her and and I'm sure regrets it immediately afterwards. I made the case in this little answer here. I usually point this out in class. I think there's something very realistic about this reaction. Um, he doesn't strike out at his sisters. He doesn't strike out at his parents. Um, but the one person in his life, well, especially now that Leslie's gone, who he's probably closest to and probably loves the most, and she loves him. I mean, she's like his shadow and always wants to do things he's doing and wants to be like him. You know, sometimes, in these kind of situations, we're inclined to strike out and if not, hopefully not physically, but you know what I mean. You know, what's the old expression? You always hurt the ones you love. Sometimes, you hold it in and then when somebody that's really close to you and you love so much says or does the wrong thing, that's when you snap. And, um, and maybe in the back of his head, I don't want to get too psychoanalytical about this, but maybe in the back of his head, he wouldn't strike out at any of the other people in his life because he's afraid that, he might totally alienate them. But I think he had a feeling that, I know she's gonna love me no matter what I do or say, and maybe I can let my feelings out. And of course, this isn't encouraging physical violence in any way, but I hope you get what I'm trying to say. You know, uh, she says uh, the wrong thing at the wrong time, and and he just snaps. Um, all right. And then what are some lessons that he learns from his experiences? I think I'll share some of your answers to this question too. Here were some of mine. Again, the importance of having a friend who encourages you, who watches your back, and you watch their back. The importance of getting out of your comfort zone. I think that might be one of the main things she teaches him. He talks about this later. I think I'll quote the line maybe in Monday's lecture. But he talks about this. I learned from her, you know, and there are things I learned from her that I'll never forget, even though she's no longer here. And one of them is, to try to do things. He talks a couple of times in the story about, oh, he's always afraid. He's afraid. He's always afraid to do this or afraid to do that because he's afraid of what people will think of him, or he's afraid he might fail, or he's afraid of whatever. So he never tries to do anything. And then she comes into his life and she says, okay, come on, let's go into the woods, which is, well, we know from fairy tales, the woods is traditionally, a scary place to go. Come on, let's make the woods our fantasy land. We'll call it Terabithia. And he goes along and he loses his fear of doing things and trying to experience different things that he would never have done unless she had encouraged him to do that. All right. And of course, and again, I'm going to save this discussion for Monday's video after I've read your comments on this. But, grief is not any one reaction. It's really a process that we go through, and that's okay. And I think that's a good lead into what we're going to talk about, because I want to see your answers to this. I don't want to answer this for you, but I think, the thing I wanted to focus on most in this book was how it deals with the death of a loved one, which is something kids are going to start to experience when they're children. And I think, there are lessons here that we will share. Okay, so I'm going to save that discussion for our next video. So again, just as a reminder, let's go through the homework again. So again, watch my lecture, take note of the numbers, read the presentations. There are 4 of them from the students in the fantasy group. Read some corresponding pages in the packet. Start to read Wonder, and then do the realistic precepts assignment, and that'll be worth 20 quiz points. And that's what you will email to me along with the numbers in our sequence. All right. Okay, that's all I have for today. Thanks for joining me. Have a great weekend, and we will see you on Monday.